Wonderful. Welcome again to Bloomerang Academy, and thank you for joining us today where we are talking about Zapier 201. Joining us today is Jessie Gilchrist. This is the third in a series of webinars that's completing our incremental education on or dive into Zapier integrations for Bloomerang. If you weren't able to attend our webinars, we'll have links to those as well. Jessie is a Zapier certified expert and Bloomerang integrations consultant at Sidekick Solutions. Sidekick Solutions is a Bloomerang partner specializing in system automations for Bloomerang, and they've been a Bloomerang user since 2013, and most recently was part of the Bloomerang team that launched the Zapier app. We're very excited to have Jessie here today to share her expertise and explore Bloomerang integrations with us. So welcome, Jessie.
Awesome. Thanks, Diana. Well, I left my webcam on so you can see my face, but I'm going to go ahead and turn it off as we're going to be doing a lot of demos in Zapier today and want to make sure you can focus on that content. But very excited to be here and to dive into this next session here in our webinar series. So as Diana mentioned, this webinar is the third in a series that is really completing an incremental dive into Zapier and Zapier integrations for Bloomerang. So if you were not able to attend our webinar last month that explored common automation opportunities for nonprofits, or our Zapier 101 webinar 2 weeks ago, really recommend watching the recordings on Bloomerang's Academy page or its YouTube channel. If you weren't able to attend specifically this Zapier 101 webinar or didn't watch the recording, some of the concepts we covered today may feel a little bit advanced as we're gonna dive right in. So we recommend also watching Zapier 101 if you haven't yet, because it covers some of the key concepts and foundational elements of Zapier and the Bloomerang Zapier app. And I believe Diana is going to send the links for the past webinars in the chat. So look for those as those come through here in just a minute. Now, following today's webinar, we do have another one scheduled in August, and we're giving a couple of weeks between today's webinar and this next one. But we are approaching this as an Ask Me Anything style webinar where you can submit your questions about Zapier integrations and get a response from a Bloomerang and Zapier integration expert. Our hope is that by the end of this webinar series, you will have a better understanding of how you can implement automations across your organization and really further the outcomes that drive your mission and goals. So our webinar today focuses on the utilities in Zapier that can be leveraged to customize your automations. So depending on a poll we're going to do here in a minute, we may start with a quick intro of Zapier and when to pursue Zapier integrations. And then we are going to dive through, I believe, 6 different integration challenges and the solutions or utilities that can be used in Zapier to solve for those. And then again, if we have some time at the end, we'll cover getting started with Zapier if there are any attendees who haven't gotten started with Zapier yet. So we'd love to start by doing a quick poll to see how many of you attended our earlier webinars in this series. So let us know if you attended the Exploring Bloomerang Automations and Zapier 101, or only one of those webinars, or if you didn't attend or watch either.
Thanks, Jessie. We'll give a couple more seconds for folks to answer. I've put the link in the chat for the previous webinars, but also a reminder that everyone's going to get a copy of the slides. So all of the resources that we'll be sharing with you today are also linked there as well. So don't worry if you might miss out on the link today, you're going to get those in the slide as well. And so far, it looks like we have 67% didn't attend or watch either webinar. 22% attended or watched Zapier 101, and 6% apiece each for attended and watched both, as well as attended and watched Bloomerang automations, exploring Bloomerang automations.
Perfect. Thank you, Diana. So since there's quite a few of you that didn't attend the earlier webinars, we want to do a quick overview of Zapier just to set the stage. If you did attend the prior webinars, appreciate you bearing with us the next couple of slides as this will be a review. Zapier is a piece of automation software. It sits between your Bloomerang database and any other apps you use, helping them talk to each other. And this can even come in the form of Bloomerang to Bloomerang automations to support operational tasks with your Bloomerang database. The Bloomerang Zapier app really extends the power and scope of your database by enabling integrations with over 5,000 other applications in Zapier's directory. The beauty of Zapier is that it really was designed for anyone to build an integration, and you don't need to be a developer or know code to build an automation. So it's a very accessible tool to set up automations for your organization. We'll go ahead and show where that Zapier directory is located. So if you go to zapier.com/apps, you can see Zapier's marketplace and search for any app you may be using to see if there is an app in the marketplace to connect with Bloomerang. So that's zapier.com/apps. Now, when we talk about Bloomerang integrations, there are two types we should differentiate between really quickly: native and Zapier. Native integrations are often called direct integrations and are built within your Bloomerang software. These are often the most user-friendly form of integration and offer a standardized templated sync of data between two systems. Now, the other option for integration is to pursue a custom integration using Zapier. Zapier allows you to build custom workflows that align with your organization's use case. And typically organizations pursue a custom Zapier integration when maybe no native integration exists between Bloomerang and the other app. The native integration doesn't align with your organization's use case, or you have a high level of customization that's needed. Or maybe there's different functionality that you're looking to use. Or also multi-app automations. So stringing together automations that connect Bloomerang with more than one application in the same workflow. Now we're going to dive right in. So again, for those of you who didn't attend the 101 webinar, some of this may feel a little advanced. So recommend going back to watch that one as well. But we're going to dive right into some Bloomerang integration challenges and the Zapier utilities that can support and solve those challenges. So the first challenge we often hear is, how can I make sure the donation, interaction, or task that I'm creating in my Bloomerang automation is created on the correct constituents timeline? And this comes down to what we call dynamic mapping in Zapier. Now, this is a Zapier key concept because there are two ways to map fields in Zapier. We can hard code a field, or we can use custom or dynamic mapping. Hard coding is when we type in or select a static value in Zapier, and this results in every record that is created or updated in our automation being assigned the same value or the same data. Now, custom mapping is dynamic. Data from our source application, or even a prior action in our Zap, is mapped to our action in Zapier. And what this means is that when the Zap runs, the data specifically related to that run is mapped from our source to our target. Meaning that if we had an email address triggering in an automation or coming from a source application outside of Bloomerang, every time that Zap runs, the email associated with that triggering event would be dynamically mapped into this field. It wouldn't be a static value. Now, there are a few common use cases in automations where dynamic mapping comes into play. So as this challenge that we're presenting talks about, creating records tied to a specific constituent. This could be a donation, an interaction, or a task. This can also be updating an existing record, like updating a constituent in Bloomerang. This can be mapping one or more values from the source to our target application. And this is also used following formatters or formatting steps, conversion steps, and lookups, which we're going to cover some of these here later in our webinar. But dynamic mapping is the basis of taking the output of those formatting or conversion steps and mapping it to our subsequent action in our Zap. Now in Bloomerang and in Bloomerang automations, dynamic mapping is typically used to map the constituent ID from a find create constituent search to the Bloomerang actions below. So again, to create a donation, an interaction or a task, or update a constituent. To map values from our source application to our system or system or custom fields in Bloomerang. And to support mapping of multiple values to multi-select custom fields in Bloomerang. Now, let's take a look at what this looks like in practice in a real Zap. So I'm going to hop over to Zapier. Now we're going to start by demoing how to dynamically map the constituent ID returned by a find or create constituent action to a create donation action in Bloomerang. So this dynamic mapping ensures that the donation that we are creating right here in step 7 is added to the timeline of the constituent that was found or created in step 4. Now this is a foundational Zap that I already have set up. I've got some of the elements of my Zap ready here, especially for us to demo today. And so this workflow that we're going to use for a number of our demos is a workflow that's syncing new successful transactions in Classy, which is a fundraising app, to find or create a constituent and create a donation in Bloomerang. Now, in order to dynamically map the constituent ID from the find create constituent action, we need to actually test the action in Zapier. So I've already pulled in a sample transaction in my trigger right here that I can use for my mapping. And I have set up my mapping to my find or create constituent action. So I've got my search fields, and then I've got all of the details right here that would be used if this supporter or this donor from Classy doesn't match an existing constituent in my Bloomerang database. Now to test this, I'm going to go down to the bottom and I'm going to click test action. And I'm going to click retest and review. Now it's important to know that when we are testing actions that are searching or writing data to Bloomerang, that if this were to have created a new constituent account on this test, it actually would reflect it in our Bloomerang database. So as you are setting up a Zap and you're testing your steps, just know that if it is a create step, so again, if it didn't match a constituent and created a new one, or down here, if we are testing our create donation, these will actually create records in your Bloomerang database. So if that test should not remain, you'll need to do a little bit of cleanup in Bloomerang after you test your action. So now that we've tested our find or create constituent action, you can see right here in the data that was returned, there is an ID field. This is our constituent ID that we need to map to our create donation action in order to ensure that that donation is created on the timeline of the constituent that was found or created. So we're going to scroll down now to our create donation action, which is our subsequent Bloomerang action. And I'm going to go right here to the setup action section. So we're going to choose our app or event is Bloomerang. We're going to create a donation. We selected our Bloomerang connection, and then we've got our action. Now this constituent field up here, if we were to click in this box, we would see that this is going to populate with all of the constituents in our database. Hard coding, as we talked about a couple minutes ago, would be selecting one constituent, and every time the Zap runs, it's creating a donation for that single constituent. Now, there's very limited use cases where that is the case. Most of the time, we want this to be dynamic, meaning that the donation is going to be created for the founder-created constituent. So instead of selecting or hard coding the constituent, I'm going to click Custom. And then I'm going to expand the Finder Create Constituent action right here. And this returns the data from that test we performed. I'm going to click Show All Options. And I'm going to scroll until I find that ID field. And I'm just going to click on it. For those of you that are familiar with a mail merge, it has a similar feel to it, where we're mapping the data element or the field that we want to use when this runs in the Zap. So now that this is mapped, the next time, if our Zap was live, a successful transaction is created in Classy, it would take the details of that donor to find or create our constituent. And then this ID would ensure that the donation that is created is added to the timeline of that constituent. Now let's take a look at how we can use dynamic mapping to map to single and multi-select fields, in a similar manner to how we did the constituent ID. So we're going to stay on the same create donation action. And we're simply going to scroll down until we get to where our custom fields are on this action. So right here is where I start my custom fields. You can tell your custom fields because the custom field category is going to be separated with two little arrows and then the custom field name. Now we're going to map on this one. We're going to go to our tribute type. And similar to how we did for the constituent ID, instead of hard coding a value, which means selecting the same value that'd be assigned for every record, I'm going to choose custom. And in our new successful transaction in Classy, I'm going to choose my dedication type. So I'm going to map dynamically that value from my Classy transaction so that it dynamically codes this donation in Bloomerang if there was a tribute with the type of tribute that it was. Now this is a single select field, meaning that we aren't assigning multiple values in Bloomerang. But let's scroll down to a update constituent in Bloomerang action, because I want to show how similarly this would be if we were mapping data or assigning values to a multi-select field. So in our update constituent action, in a similar manner, we have our ID from our Finder Create Constituent mapped. And then I'm going to scroll down to my program interests, custom field, right here. So program interest is a multi-select field in our Bloomerang database. And so again, I could dynamically map values from a prior action, or I could hard code values. So let's say every time a donation comes from Classy, for using our Classy pages for specific programs, we could code one or more values in this field, either by hard coding the values, or again, by dynamically mapping them from our trigger or a prior action. With multi-select, as you can see, it continues to give you, every time you select a value, it gives you another field so you could select or assign or map from a prior step, map the corresponding value that you'd want to assign. Now that we've covered dynamic mapping, let's hop back over and talk about our second challenge. So following along the same kind of use case of syncing donations from a fundraising app to Bloomerang, a common question or challenge is, how do I change the fund, campaign, or appeal coded on the donation to align with the fundraising effort or campaign? So this is done using a lookup table. Lookup tables are another key concept in Zapier. So this is a way to convert data from your source application to the corresponding value in your target application. In a lookup table, the lookup key is the data we want to search for or look up in our table. Sometimes this will be a human readable value or label, like where it's needed most. And other times it may be an ID for that value or that record. Now, when possible, as kind of a best practice, we recommend using IDs if they're available, because a system ID from your source application will remain static, even if the human readable label or value is modified. Not all systems or fields will present you with an ID to use instead, but if possible, it is a great best practice to do that, as it prevents future errors if the label of that field or that value changes. Now, if the step is successful and finds a match in our lookup table, it returns the related value for mapping into our target system. So a lookup table is essentially a conversion. It's ingesting how the data is coming in from our source application and returning to us for mapping what we want to assign in our target system. Now, there are two different apps that can be used to create a lookup table in Zapier. You can use Formatter by Zapier, or you can use Google Sheets. Now, we're going to demo both of these in a minute, but I want to start by talking about what the benefits of each app are. The use of one or the other is truly dependent on your automation use case. So Formatter by Zapier is a free app in Zapier's marketplace that can be used to create a really simple lookup table. Formatter by Zapier allows you to return a single value for the lookup. It can look up and return a value for each line item in a record. So this is common for e-commerce orders, Shopify, WooCommerce, things of that nature. And it can assign a fallback value, which is a default value that would be assigned if the lookup data is not found in the table. Now, Google Sheets is another viable option for including a lookup table in your solution, and it provides different benefits. So with Google Sheets, you can return multiple values in the lookup, meaning if we are trying to convert the fundraising campaign from our fundraising app and return the fund campaign and appeal related to that, we can accommodate that in a Google Sheet, whereas Zapier or Formatter by Zapier would require separate lookups, one for fund, one for campaign, and one for appeal. Google Sheets also allows users to easily edit and update the lookup table outside of the live Zap. So if you don't want to be making edits or updates in the Zap that is live and running, a Google Sheet is a great option to manage a lookup table in a way that your team can access, again, without touching the live automation. And it also can support a lookup based off of two values. Now, lookup tables are used for a variety of purposes in Bloomerang automations. Most common is to look up the corresponding fund campaign or appeal based on a fundraising campaign, an event ID, or an item purchased in an e-commerce store like Shopify or WooCommerce. But it can also be used to convert field values from your source application into the corresponding value that you want to assign in Bloomerang. I like to think of this option a little bit as Google Translate, where it's ingesting how your source application presents or spells or formats a value and returns it in Bloomerang language or in the values you have in your Bloomerang database. And it can also go the other direction. So we can convert data from Bloomerang into the corresponding value that would need to be assigned in another application if you are syncing data from Bloomerang to another app. Now let's go ahead and take a look at this in Zapier. And we are going to start by showing the Formatter by Zapier setup first. So this is the same workflow we were just looking at, which is a new successful transaction in Classy. And we're going to come down, and right here, I have a step where I want to look up the Bloomerang campaign using the classy campaign ID. So in this case, all I did was click the little plus sign in my Zap and select Formatter by Zapier. And as I mentioned, Formatter by Zapier is a free app in Zapier's marketplace. I'm going to choose an action event of utilities. And a transform type of lookup table. And this is going to present me a lookup table where I can map my lookup key and create my lookup table with my source values on the left and my target values on the right. Now I'm going to go ahead and click into the one I've got right here. Looks like I did take myself out of this. Okay. Pull this up. So we are going to map, in this case, from Classy. As I mentioned on one of the previous slides, we want to map the campaign ID if we can, instead of the campaign name from Classy, because it allows that if the organization changes the name of the campaign in Classy, that the ID is still a static value and isn't going to change, meaning we don't need to update our lookup table. So I'm just going to search for campaign ID, and you can see it right here. I could also just expand this new successful transaction in Classy and scroll until I find my campaign ID. Now this is our lookup key. So every time the Zap runs, it's going to take the campaign ID from that successful transaction and look it up in the column on the left. This is going to be our source values. And let's say that this one should go to our unrestricted or our annual campaign. And then we would just continue to click the plus sign and add all of our campaign IDs from Classy. So one, and let's say this one is our annual gala. And then you can see how easy it is to just build this lookup table. So the way that the Formatter by Zapier app works is that when it does this lookup, again, it can only return a single value. So what this means is that if we wanted to dynamically code the fund, campaign, and appeal in Bloomerang based on the campaign ID from Classy, we would actually need 3 separate formatters. Essentially one lookup table per field in Bloomerang, one for fund, one for campaign, and one for appeal. Now, an important thing to note is that these Bloomerang values on the left, and even the source values the source values on the left and the Bloomerang values on the right, these are case, spelling, capitalization sensitive, meaning if our value in Bloomerang is listed as annual campaign and we put this with a lowercase c, or we put a 2022 on the end, it is not going to find the match in Bloomerang, and it would actually return an error in Zapier. So it's important that our source values and our target values match the values, spelling, punctuation, capitalization for that system exactly. Now, again, this is where we could assign a fallback value. So if our campaign isn't present in this lookup table, we can go ahead and assign a fallback value. Maybe it's for our annual campaign. Now, when we test this step, go ahead and skip through this test here real quick. I'm going to come back to filters, but go ahead and delete this for now. Okay. So when I test this step, it's going to take in my lookup key, which is my campaign ID, and it's going to return the campaign related to that ID. And you can see right there, it gives us an output. And then we can go to our create donation action, click custom to do our dynamic mapping. and map in from that step the output, which is that converted campaign value using the classy campaign ID. So again, similar to what we did for our constituent ID, this campaign will dynamically code with every Zap run based off of the classy campaign and which campaign for Bloomerang was returned in our lookup table. Now let's look at this same step, but using a Google Sheet. So before we actually add a lookup in a Google Sheet, I've got a step ready right here for us. But before we add this lookup, we want to set our Google Sheet up first. So when we use a Google Sheet as a lookup table, the first row in our Google Sheet will always be our header row. And it's important to put headers because this is what Zapier grabs and goes ahead and uses these essentially as field labels in the editor itself. So I've gone ahead and set this one up. I've included the classy campaign name just as a reference in my Google Sheet. I've put my classy campaign ID. And then this, as I mentioned earlier, we can dynamically look up the fund, campaign, and appeal for a single campaign in classy and in a single Google Sheet lookup step. So I've gone ahead and included my columns for all three. Now you could do this lookup for just fund or fund and campaign or fund and appeal, really based off of your organization's use case and preference. Now, once our lookup table is set up, I'm going to hop back into Zapier. I've got an action here, and this is just in Google Sheets. And the action is Lookup Spreadsheet Row. So it's not called a lookup table like Formatter by Zapier, but it performs the same function. So we're going to look up our spreadsheet row. And I'm going to search for my spreadsheet, which is Zapier 201. And I can choose which worksheet in that Google Sheet is used for my lookup table. So I'm going to choose my demo lookup table. Now the lookup column, this is where I get to choose which column in my table I'm using to look up my campaign ID. So in this case, I want column B. And that's going to be called our classy campaign ID right here. So I'm just going to select that that is the column I want to use as my lookup. And the lookup value is going to be the same as we did in our formatters when we did this with Formatter. We are going to add the campaign ID from our successful transaction in classy. Right here. As I mentioned earlier, Google Sheets does allow for essentially a two-value lookup, meaning we could look up using the campaign ID and another identifier or designation on the transaction. But this is not required. Most lookup tables typically use one field, especially in Bloomerang automations, but for more advanced use cases, you can do a two-field lookup. So I'm going to click continue, and I'm going to test my action. And so in this case, we're looking up this row right here, I believe. And so when I test this, it's going to return my fund, my campaign right here, my fund campaign and my appeal, which I can then map in my create donation action. So this allows me to pull all three into my automation in a single step instead of having to use a separate formatter step for each field. So we can just come in and I'm going to map my Bloomerang fund. And these are all dynamic mappings again. My campaign. And my appeal. So now I've got those dynamically mapped. Now let's hop over to our next challenge. So we often get asked, what do I do if the record that triggers my Zap has elements that need to be processed differently? Can I use conditional logic in Zapier? And the answer is yes. Conditional logic is supported in Zapier using filters and paths. Filters in Zapier allow you to set one or many conditions for your automation using and or logic. And your Zap will only continue if the conditions are met. So if the conditions aren't met, your Zap stops. And if they are met, it will continue on to any subsequent actions. Paths in Zapier are an advanced action that are only available in professional subscription tiers or higher. But what paths allow you to do is to branch your Zap down up to 3 separate paths. And the Zap will only proceed down that path if the conditions are met in a similar manner to filters. Now, filters and paths are typically used in automations to either manage Zapier task usage, so ensuring that you're not proceeding down an automation to update or create records when it's not needed, and also to control when certain actions are performed. So you can use a combination of filters and paths in a Zap and even nest paths and filters within each other. So they really can build on each other. It's not a one-time use in an automation. You can use them a number of times as needed. Now, in practice, filters are most commonly used in Bloomerang automations to only continue if you're using a Bloomerang trigger, to only continue if the constituent has a certain custom field value, or potentially to only update a constituent if the find or create constituent action matched to an existing constituent. Paths are most often used when syncing constituents into Bloomerang and your source application has both individual and company records. You'll need to use paths in order to successfully find or create individual versus organization constituents, as that cannot be accomplished in a single action in the Bloomerang Zapier app. So I want to take a look at this in practice in a real Zap. And so once again, we're going to go back to our classy to Bloomerang Zap. So when I come here, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to implement what we at Psychic Solutions call our initial filter. So in this case, successful transactions in Classy can be created in a $0 amount for a free event, if utilizing the event registration or ticketed event feature in Classy, as well as a type of donation can be entered, which is called an offline donation. And it's a way to just attribute gifts received outside of the Classy platform to a campaign goal or to track campaign progress. So we often filter those out as they carry limited details on the constituent. And typically they are cash check, donor advised fund donations that are entered directly into Bloomerang already. So for this initial filter, I'm going to go ahead and click the plus sign. And I'm going to select filter as my app. Again, Filter by Zapier, similar to Formatter by Zapier, is a free app. And what it allows us to do is set up one or many conditions that the Zap run will compare against, and if the conditions are met, only proceed. Now, there are a number of logic operators, this is the center part here, that we can use to define the conditions for our filter. So we have some text operators, some number ones, date and time, true or false, and if data exists or does not exist. Now on the left, this is the data from our preceding step or our trigger that we want to use as the start or that we want to apply our condition against. So in this case, I want to say that the Zap should only continue if the amount, oops, if I can spell here. Not here. So you can see this one's actually a $0 transaction here. So if our amount, and I'm going to use a number logic operator, if our amount is greater than 0. So we're only going to proceed down our Zap if our amount is greater than 0. Now, the other one we're going to do is that we are also going to use and logic. So again, we can use and or, but in this case, we're going to use and logic to say the amount is greater than 0. And the payment method right here does not match offline. So it's only going to proceed and continue to sync the transaction to Bloomerang if the amount's greater than 0 and the donation wasn't entered through the offline functionality in Classy. So you can see this allows us to test it similar to all of our other actions, and we can test and see if our Zap would have continued or not based off of the record we've selected as a sample in our trigger. And we can even expand this to see what which criteria matched versus didn't match our conditions. Now let's take a look at how we've set up our last filter here in our Zap. So this is a filter to only continue to update the constituent if a constituent was found in our find or create constituent action. So this is a way to control task usage in Zapier, because it will stop the Zap and not use these additional tasks if a new constituent was created. So I can show you this one here. So in this one, what we're going to do is there is a field that is returned in our find create constituent action that's called Zap data was found. I can type Zap data right here. Zap data was found. And this is a true or false field. So this will always be returned by the Bloomerang Zapier app following a find or create constituent action. And this allows us to say that we only want to continue if this is true, meaning data was found and it matched to an existing constituent. Because if this field is false, it means it created a new constituent, which means updating that constituent isn't necessary. So we use this filter very frequently before any update constituent action in order to only update the constituent if it matched to an existing one. Now, the Classy to Bloomerang Zap that we've been demoing here, these last few challenges we've walked through, doesn't use paths. But I want to go ahead and show you really quickly how the setup of paths works. So let's say at some point earlier in this Zap, likely before our find create constituent action, we had wanted to proceed down separate paths based on whether the donor is a company or an individual. In that case, as we were building our Zap, again, likely would have been right here after step 3, we would go ahead and click the plus sign and choose path as our action. Again, paths are only supported if you have a professional Zapier subscription or higher, but can be really supportive based on your use case. So I'm going to go ahead and just click edit on my first path here. Again, we could add another path. We can add up to 3, but I can go ahead and click edit, and I'm going to rename my path and call this one individual. And when I click continue, it's going to allow me to set my conditions, and this operates in the exact same manner as filters. So if you understand how filters work, you'll understand how paths work. So I'm going to go ahead and base my condition based off of whether there's a company name. So if there's no company name, I'm going to say it does not exist. That means it's an individual. And then I can go to my other path. We're going to rename this company. And if the company name does exist this time, so this is the inverse logic. So this one's going to say it does exist. It will proceed down this path. So this allows our Zap to be smart and to only proceed down either the individual or the company path based on whether the company name exists or does not exist. Now we've covered quite a bit, and I know we have more to go, but I want to take a real quick pause. Diana, if there are any questions we want to cover real quick, or if we're good to keep moving forward.
I think we're good for now. Let's keep moving.
Perfect. So the next one we're going to cover is, this question is pretty common. I think my source application is giving me a date in a different time zone. How do I make sure I'm assigning the date in Bloomerang related to my time zone? And so this solution is date formatting. So formatted by Zapier, which we use for our lookup table solution, can also be used to reformat or convert dates. And there are actually utilities in the Formatter by Zapier app to reformat a date, add or subtract dates, or compare dates. Now, formatting dates could be either changing the date format or also converting the time zone. Now, formatting right here is really the most common action when working with dates. So this is the one we're going to focus on today. In Bloomerang automations, Formatter by Zapier is typically used to format a date time field coming from our source application as simply a year, month, day. This is the preferred date format when mapping into Bloomerang. We use this to convert a date time field that's coming out of our source application in the UTC time zone to your own time zone. Let's use Eastern as an example. Or we also use Formatter to calculate expiration dates for membership. So if a membership payment comes in and their expiration date is meant to be 1 year from the date of the transaction, we can use Formatter by Zapier to calculate that date. So once again, we're going to head back to Zapier and go back to our Classy to Bloomerang app or workflow that we've got right here. So we're going to go to this step I've already gotten started, which is to format our date from Classy, which comes in as a UTC date or a date time field. We are going to format it as year, month, day in the Eastern time zone. So we're going to open our action. And in our app or event, we're going to choose an action event of date time and a transform of format. So in this case, we've mapped in our purchased at date time that comes from Classy. I'm aware this is a 2021 date time. This is from a test transaction we did about a year ago now, but the conversion will still hold up. And this allows us to define the format and time zone that we are converting from. So the format and time zone from our source application, and identify which time zone and which format we want to convert it to. So again, this is dynamic mapping, just syncing the purchase stat date from our Classy app right here. And then these are hard-coded formatting that we've set up or selections we've made of how we want to convert this data. So if we test this action, it's going to perform those conversions and return our year, month, day value that we can then map into our create donation like we have right here. So this is the output of our formatter step for that date and time conversion. Now, the last one we want to walk through, or the challenge, is that we hear this question about that customers often purchase more than one item from an e-commerce store, and we need to code the fund, campaign, or appeal differently based on the item they purchased. How can we do this? So the answer is line item support. So this is a Zapier key concept. And line items are a subset of individual items presented in a collection of data called an array. This is a really fancy way of just saying they are almost like objects that are nested on another object. So this could be items in an e-commerce order, split transactions in Bloomerang related to a single payment, things along that nature. Now, line items work best in Zapier when you are using a trigger and actions that both support line items. It's really important to note that not all triggers and actions or not all Zapier apps will provide line item support. Now, the description for a trigger or an action will identify if it supports line items. And as we discussed earlier, if you're dealing with line items and you need to do a lookup table, We recommend using Formatter by Zapier and not Google Sheets, because Formatter by Zapier provides line item support in that lookup table, and the Google Sheet Lookup Spreadsheet Row does not. In Bloomerang automations, we typically see line items used in two scenarios: syncing split donations in Bloomerang to an accounting software on a single sales receipt or invoice, meaning there's one line item per split from Bloomerang. Or it could be items purchased in an e-commerce order, creating a split transaction in Bloomerang. So one split per item that was purchased. Now, to demonstrate how line items work, we're going to create a split transaction in Bloomerang and show how the data will present differently in a Google Sheet if we treat the splits as line items versus not. So I have two zaps here that are just triggering off of a new transaction in Bloomerang, and one has line item support and the other one does not. So this is really a difference between this action right here that Google Sheets presents, which is create spreadsheet row, does not provide line item support, or using the version of it, create spreadsheet rows, which does have line item support. So in this case, I'm just writing transactions from Bloomerang to a Google Sheet. And really what this allows us to do is that we can see a difference between these two. So you can see here's how it looks if there's no line item support. If we do have line item support, there's a slight difference in how Zapier presents the data. You can see this light gray box. This is a great indicator when working in an app that it has line item support, as Zapier will always present that gray box around the fields that are supported by line items. So some fields will be it may be that all fields are supported for line items, or it may be just some fields are. And so looking for that gray box will help indicate for you which fields can be mapped to for line items. Now, if we were to test this and actually create a split transaction in Bloomerang, we can see the difference here. I've already pushed these through, so I'm going to show you. We can see how this would look if we didn't use line item support. So this is coming from a transaction in Bloomerang, and this is the same transaction. You can see the differences in how the data is presented if it's a single transaction without line item support versus if we're using Zapier triggers and actions that do support line items. It allows it to split apart the two segments of that split transaction in Bloomerang as separate rows, so we can see that data really cleanly for each split. Now, we had a couple slides here on getting started in Zapier, but we're running up on time, so I'd rather instead focus on the resources that are available in Zapier. So if you go to zapier.com/help, they have great resources on lookup tables, filters and paths, modifying date time formats, and using line items. So these are great resources. When the slides get shared out, you should be able to click these links and navigate to those resources, but you can also do your own exploring at the zapier.com/help. Show you what that looks like here. In the Help Center. There's a great search option. You can also look through some quick get start guides if you're just getting started with Zapier. And just search by keywords. And it'll return resources to support you in setting up those different utilities to support your automations. Again, if you have an interest in learning more about Bloomerang and Zapier or have a specific integration question, be sure to tune into our Ask Me Anything here towards the end of August. We'll go ahead and looks like Diana just sent out the registration link for that one, so we're excited to get you in there. It's been a pleasure meeting with you today. Obviously, we covered some fairly advanced concepts. If you'd like to work with a consultant to set up Zaps or develop a custom Bloomerang integration, or even just want to explore a use case, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm going to hand it off to Diana for a quick poll before we open up for any final questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jessie. I've gone ahead and launched a poll. Let us know if you would like a follow-up session with Jessie and or someone from her team to help you through working how to make these connections from the different tools that you use. And I have a question for you, Jessie. And I think a lot of people might be feeling this way, that it can feel a little bit overwhelming seeing all the different possibilities. If I'm one of those folks that I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed, like where do I start? What do I do? How can we help with that? Or yeah, where's a good place to start?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say we have, I think, Deanna, how many webinars have we done now? Probably about 10, maybe 11. In Bloomerang Academy, there are a number of webinars we've done on actual real step-by-step builds of integrations with Bloomerang. It may not be your specific use case or even the app you're using, but if you want to get a sense for what these utilities look like in real automations, you can skip through the first 20 minutes of most of them, which is the intro to Zapier that we covered already. But just if you want to get some more familiarity with how to build Zaps and what that looks like specifically with using Bloomerang, you know, there's great ones for MailChimp and Google Sheets and oh gosh, I'm trying to think of the other ones we've done. My brain's blanking, but they're in Bloomerang Academy. There's a bunch of them. They're also on our Sidekick website as well. Again, if you have questions, let us know. The Zapier 101 webinar, again, if you haven't watched it, is a great place to start because that is really the foundation for everything we walk through today. It is, how does Zapier work? How do we use Bloomerang triggers, actions, and searches? That in terms of building that confidence in Zapier, I would say the Zapier 101 webinar is going to be kind of our flagship. Go watch that first. So if you haven't watched that first, definitely watch that. And then again, those other webinars are going to be helpful just if you want to see practical application of what building as an actual Zap or an automation for Bloomerang looks like.
And I think that's the benefit of having a consultant as well. Like, you know, you may watch the classes a couple of times and you still might be lost a little bit. And it's helpful to have someone look at that with you. It's just always helpful to have that second pair of eyes too. So please don't hesitate to reach out, even if you're not sure yet what you want to do, or, you know, like you just have a problem, you want to make things more automated and more streamlined. You're not quite sure how. Jessie and her team can help with the how.
Absolutely. Yep. We're always here. Our door is open.
Lovely. I also have a question for everyone. I wonder what you all are most excited about based on what you saw today. Like, what kind of automations are you possibly interested in trying? Let us know. And don't forget that the next in our series of Zapier classes is an Ask Me Anything. So if there's anything that you want to try out prior to that, so you have your questions ready, I highly encourage you to watch the previous recordings that we have so you can try those out for yourselves as well and try the different use cases that we talk about. And we have, we're right at time. Thank you again, Jessie, so much for a lot of great information. There is always so much to talk about. I know all of you are going to have your own unique use cases for how you might use Zapier and Bloomerang together. So we hope this gives you a good starting point. Any last minute parting words for our friends today, Jessie?
I think, the best place is to, again, if you haven't already, sign up for Zapier. Again, look at one of their Get Started guides, watch the 101 webinar. So at least play around in Zapier a little bit and see what questions you have, and send those to the Bloomerang team or to us at Sidekick ahead of the AMA, so that we can make sure we get those addressed for you for any challenges or any questions you have about Bloomerang Zapier automations.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Jessie. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you in the Zapier Ask Me Anything, if not sooner.
Awesome. Thanks, Anna. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.